The time finally came to work on the exterior of the house. The plan has always been to do board and batten, and as you can see, I've gotten started a little bit here on this corner, and I'm already learning a few bits as I go along. Like most of the wood you've seen us use, this is yellow poplar, also known as tulip here locally. And you can see it's got some really nice grain. Sean milled these boards 1 inch thick, and then I simply put them on the planer, planed a little bit on both sides, and mounted a few to kind of get an idea of how it was going to look based on what our plan had been. Unfortunately, it didn't work out quite like I'd hoped. So we've made a few modifications to the original plan, and I'm going to show you what I found as I got started. This here is a pile of the raw lumber I started with. Sean milled all of this poplar into just slightly over 1 inch boards, and they've been drying for several months, not counting the nearly 2 years they've been sitting stacked on the log pile. So you can see here that they are cracked on the ends. So most of these ends will kind of be trimmed off, and then they'll be run through the planer. I'm removing about 1/4 inch of the wood total with the planer, so it gives me a fairly flat plank to start with. Then, as you may recall from previous videos, you have to look at the grain on this board. Once I've got it cut and planed, then I'm going to look at the end of it to see which way the grain is laying. You can see here there's a slight smiley face of sorts, or I guess you could call it a frown. You see how that line arcs. And that tells me which way this generally wants to cup. Now keep in mind, it wants to cup in the opposite direction of the arc that's currently there. So let's say this frown is kind of the way the grain is running on that wood. That grain wants to straighten out, or those arches. And obviously when it straightens, it's going to cause the other side of the board to warp. So you wind up with cupping. So we have to keep this in mind. And one of the ways you do that is to install the board with that frown kind of smiling outwards towards you, if that makes sense. So it's arching away and then coming back. So if I put that on to the wall, then I'm able to fasten it, and that holds the center portion in there, which helps take some of the stress when it's pushing against the wall. All it really does is create a tighter fit. Hopefully that's all making sense. But this is the way, you would typically install it based on that rule of thumb that it's going to cup. Unfortunately, that's where I ran into my first problem. We've installed a lot of boards like this. As you may recall, we've done our stalls, we've done our barn, I've put them on the inside of the house, and it has worked very well. What I didn't consider is that all those other structures, the air was able to breathe on both sides. So the wood was able to dry anytime it got moist. Well, shortly after I started installing this corner here, we had about 2 days straight of rain. A lot of humidity for several days after that. And guess what? It cupped, but not the way I was expecting. Use the shadows, but you can see here how severe this cupping was. Now these boards were almost perfectly flat when I mounted them less than a week ago. But when it rained, because I wasn't finished, I didn't have it all battened and caulked, the moisture got behind it. Well, as you can see, maybe there is board back there. So because this siding is attached directly to that foundation board, the air can't get behind it. So what's happening is the backside is getting moist, but this, as you can see, is getting direct sun. We're actually facing west right now, and that westerly sunset dried this wall really fast on the outside. So the outside of the plank got really dry, but the backside of the plank stayed wet, which results in this reverse cupping. You can see the same thing is happening up top. Interestingly enough, when I come around to the north side of the house, it's still almost perfectly straight because I didn't get the same moisture hitting it, and the moisture that did hit did not dry as quickly because this is shadowed almost all the time. So definitely keep that in mind when you start putting up board and batten. I was pretty bummed out and discouraged when I found this, and unfortunately there's not a whole lot I can do about it. I can't put the battens on until I get the trim on to make sure I get it all fit right, and I can't get the trim on until the whole side is done, and unfortunately with our schedule I can only do it parts at a time. So we're gonna make do as best we can, and you can just stay tuned for the end result as I keep moving along here. Another issue I encountered was not realizing just how small the gap around trim was. This applies to both the threshold for the door as well as the trim around all the windows. It's intended for about a 3/4 inch board or piece of siding, which is dimensional, but since we're making our own and I had only planed them down to about 7/8, then it didn't fit. So what I decided to do, we kind of talked about it, and I decided to simply bevel these tops a bit, and that way, hard to see in the shadows, but the bevel just kind of slides right up into that trim, and that will allow water to flow out really easily and still allow us to get a nice snug fit, especially once we put the trim piece on here. You may remember earlier when I ran into the problem of the backwards cupping underneath the door there. We decided to do a little experiment because it just wasn't drying and straightening, but frankly we're running low on wood, so I wanted to salvage. So I had Michaela come pop them all off, and we laid them in the sun with the moist side up to see if drying quickly would help straighten it. Lo and behold, look at there. It is almost perfectly straight again. So before I mount them again, we're going to get the battens cut, the trim ready, and everything so we can put it all up together and hold them where they belong. Okay, so I got the first section completely done and loving that. Obviously I still have to finish the upper section, but I wanted to show you a couple of things. So you can see here how the wood kind of gaps sometimes. It's a little uneven. We didn't worry about running everything through the table saw to perfectly even it up because the battens will cover it. So I got this first row of battens on, and I love the way they're looking. One little tip, our battens are 1.5 inches wide. So we actually pre-tapped the holes with the drill before I put the nail into it, just to reduce any chance of splitting. But I love the way that looked. I also want to show you another thing I decided to do. On the bottom edge of the window, and then same over here on the door trim, you can see I beveled that. So that bevel will allow water to run off. I'll still be caulking this area as quick as I get all the trim on, but we'll caulk all around it, and then the bevel will still encourage water to flow off even better to make sure there's no building up behind it. So loving the progress. This is definitely the look we were going for, and I'm really excited to see what it's going to look like when it's finished. Well, we got both sides of this section done. We are now nice and watertight. It's caulked. It's got the slants, the bevels that we talked about earlier. And I tell you what, I am so excited about how this turned out. So if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and leave us a comment. If you've ever worked with board and batten, I'd love to know if you have any tips to offer, because we still have the rest of the house to go. Thanks for watching.